I remember last Friday, I was hosting the Power Hour from this very beautiful studio here in the town of Ajax. And I remember telling myself that, wow, next week, this time, I will be hosting a session that will really reveal the true meaning of the cyber exchange. Cybersecurity is borderless, just like our networks are borderless. And I want to commend the team at siberXchange.ca, led by Maddie, for building a borderless cybersecurity community. Our engagements today are going to look at lessons learned from Canada and the Caribbean. Before I talk a little bit more about my guest today, I want to again remind you that this beautiful studio, this beautiful setup, was made possible not only by the team at siberX and siberXchange, but by the town of Ajax. Mayor Collier and his team who joined me in the previous session. Once again, big up yourself. Thank you for everything that you have done. Thank you for supporting us, and thank you for making this happen. This land belongs to the people of the Mississaugas of the Scugog Island First Nation, and it is protected under the Williams Treaties. You know, when I often thought about the Caribbean, I often thought about it as the West Indies. As a cricket buff, growing up in Dubai, watching cricketers like Curtly Ambrose or the Prince of Trinidad, Brian Lara, we never quite knew what the West Indies was because when you Googled it, you never really saw that West Indies was a country per se. And the idea of the Caribbean sort of came to being when we started understanding what do we mean by calypso music. One thing that I can tell you about the Caribbean is we learned very quickly is that if you want to go to the Caribbean, you go to a place where the Wi-Fi may be weak, but the rum is strong. The communities are well-connected, powerful, energized, and have a lot to share in terms of their experiences. Some people go to a place that is beautiful, and some people make that place beautiful. Some people make that place worthwhile visiting, worthwhile engaging with. And those people are my guests today. In the studio today, I have Mark Dillon, who joined me previously on a session. But then online, we have guests from the Caribbean, and then one special guest from Montreal as well. And I'll have them introduce themselves very quickly, person by person. Let's start off with, actually, let's go to Montreal first, and start off very quickly with Terry. Terry, welcome to the show. A quick introduction, and what brings you to the Cyber Exchange?
Sure. Thanks so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here. So I've been a previous speaker at siberX. The last conference I spoke about was internet safety for kids in the online gaming world. So we talked about some of their dangers and some of the threats that the kids are facing online in popular games. So as a quick introduction, I'm Terry Cutler. I'm a professional hacker based here out of Montreal. I do a lot of global consultation, including awareness training. So I currently have about 28,000 students in my online training program.
Yep.
And I was named to IFSEC Global's top 20 most influential people for 2 years in a row. Hopefully this will be the third year. And that's it. So a lot of my stuff is done online, and I try to share as much awareness as possible through my videos and such, and very happy to be here.
And the fact that a lot of your stuff, 99.9% of it is done online, means that there could be very interesting collaborations between Terry and the Caribbean, and I look forward to seeing what those collaborations could look like. We're going to now turn it over to the folks of the Caribbean, and I'll leave it to them to begin with their introductions. Whoever wants to go first, the floor is yours.
Afternoon, everyone. My name is Michael Khan. I'm the Vice President of Sales here at Trinidad Systems Limited. This is my first CyberX panel. I'm happy to be here, happy to be invited. I think it's a great thing that you guys are trying to introduce a unique perspective into the global community of cybersecurity and, in today's case, smarter communities. Very happy to make the acquaintance of Terry and Jordan. I actually know Delroy and Leslie from previous lives. The world is a small place. The Caribbean is even smaller. I've worked with each of them in one way or another over the last couple of years, even though Delroy and I have actually never been in the same room. We have been on a couple of teams together. I worked for companies like Cable and Wireless and IBM before that. And as you'll probably find out during the course of today's session, in the Caribbean, we tend to rotate and we find each other in one form or fashion all throughout our careers and in social lives. And I think that's a good play on our smarter community theme, where we're very connected in a lot of ways. So again, thanks for having me.
Absolutely. And I really like this aspect that you mentioned about being connected and being connected with multiple ideas and multiple thoughts. And with that, I will go to Delroy, who was introduced by Michael as well. Please tell us where you're logging in from and what brings you to the Cyber Exchange.
Hey, good afternoon, everyone. I'm logging in from Jamaica, way across the Caribbean pond from Mike and Leslie. I'm very far from Terry, thankfully, because he's a professional hacker, so no, I need to note his IP address. Thanks for that, Terry. Didn't know beforehand. Mike is absolutely right. We've been connected in different organizations, sometimes as competitors. He would have been at IBM, I'd have been at Fujitsu at the time, and then in the same organization, definitely connected there. I work for Caribbean Wireless, the Caribbean's largest ISP. We have the largest network, largest subsea fiber, largest footprint. We're a broadband fixed mobile organization that covers pretty much the larger portion of all the Caribbean's nationals. We specialize in connected communities, right?
Yeah.
Connecting communities, transforming lives, that's what we focus on. And so this is just perfectly ideal. Good timing on this one, Mike.
Yep. Speaking of cable and wireless and cricket, I clearly remember all of their sponsorships of different cricket games. So thank you for keeping us in Dubai connected to the Caribbean. Very often when our teams, especially from India, visited, you brought us back battered and bruised. So no thank you for that, but it is what it is. And lastly, there's one more gentleman left from the Caribbean. I'll turn it over to you for a very quick introduction, and then we'll go to Mark.
Hi, Ali. Firstly, thank you, siberX, for the invitation to be here. My name is Leslie Leefook. Ali, especially a great thanks to you for that beautiful introduction into the Caribbean. Next time I get married, I'm inviting you. You're going to make a speech.
All righty, I'll be there and keep the rung strong. That's all that matters.
But I'm widely considered one of the thought leaders in the Caribbean in terms of data analytics, artificial intelligence. And for me, I'm trying to make a borderless Caribbean. I want the Caribbean to be globally competitive and be able to compete. I don't want us to be known for white sands and blue waters alone. I want us to be the India of analytics someday, guys. So thank you.
Absolutely. And I think it's very important that we realize the melting pot that the Caribbean is. Many folks from the diaspora, and I think, Michael, you yourself, but Sterling, you too, would admit that the diaspora that exists in the Caribbean has a lot to offer. And more than just from a tourism perspective, there are other lessons that we can learn, which I'm really hoping that we can exchange and share with our community here today. So thank you for that. I'm going to bring it back now to the only person that's with me on the studio right now, and that is Mark Dillon. Mark, the crowd knows you quite well, but please introduce yourself and just give me one reason why this particular panel is of interest to you. Mark.
Thanks, Ali. So right now, I am the Vice President of IT for Waterloo North Hydro. That's a utility company that basically distributes power. So it's part of critical infrastructure, and it often is owned by, regardless of what the utility is, by the municipality.
We're not of interest.
We get pulled into and work with lots of smart community, intelligent community things. And that's the thread that's been common across the last 5 companies I've worked for, is we were working on initiatives to make our cities more intelligent and more livable for all the citizens.
And on that note of making it more livable, more intelligent, I'm going to go back to our friends at the Caribbean, and then we'll take a couple of comments from the Caribbean, and then we'll go to Terry and Mark, and we'll sort of play this out, because really what I want our audience to understand is something that I mentioned in my keynote, is that none of these technologies operate in a vacuum. Context is central to almost everything that is done. And I want to draw some perspective to the context in the Caribbean. Here in Canada, we have a certain understanding of how the government plays when it comes to smart community rollouts, what infrastructure, what public sector environments we have access to, what private sector partners we have access to. Can you talk to us a little bit about the context in the Caribbean when it comes to smart communities? Michael, we'll start off with you, sir.
Actually, Jordan, I'm not sure if you know, but Mark's mic isn't working. We couldn't hear anything.
You couldn't hear him? All right, so just
No.
give us a moment while we address this. And at the same time, Michael, I think you can proceed with your comments, and then once you're completed, we'll check in with Mark.
Sure. So I think the concept of smarter cities means different things to different people depending on the arc of your evolution towards that goal, right? In the Caribbean, we're disconnected but connected, right? We're a series of islands all across. There are companies, ISPs like Cable and Wireless and Digicel and a couple others who connect us, by fiber across the region. And we're still moving towards the adoption of those technologies that would qualify us as being a smarter community. With regard to Trinidad, for example, where we are in that arc really is our adoption or approach towards smarter governance, more connected utilities, smarter transport, that sort of thing. But I think at the end of the day, regardless of where you are, the important thing is that it's leading towards some kind of higher standard of living, right? There needs to be some tangible benefit to the citizenry. So, the context will really vary from island to island. For us here in Trinidad, I think we're still in the infant stages of it. But the good news is that the foundation, the connectivity piece is there. So it's just a matter of political will, private-public partnerships, and somebody to really take it by the horns.
If I can look at that piece of the public-private partnerships, then it really focuses on what's driving our push to more innovation, what's driving our push towards smart communities. Leslie, if I can bring you into the conversation, is a lot of it driven by we have to improve the situations or improve ICT access for citizens, or is a lot of it driven by how can we primarily make our technology more robust so that more tourist experiences are better? What are the driving forces between pushing why we need smart communities environments in the Caribbean?
Yeah, so the Caribbean is extremely diverse in that regard, guys. So, we consider the Caribbean from Belize all the way through the island chain down to Suriname, including Guyana, which is, you probably heard about Guyana's oil finds most recently. So tourism isn't the focus in every single country, but building capacity and infrastructure and those things are real conversations for us. But it really depends island to island because economically we're all very different. When one is up, one is down.
Yep.
And it's the ability to manage all of those relationships, manage that entire journey for every single island, every single country, and have a unified approach for the region in my regard.
Yep. I think this aspect of how you understand a particular region really impacts the way in which we discuss different topics around smart communities, knowing your audience. This is a very good moment for us to take a quick flight back to Canada, and I want to bring in Terry Cutler to this. Because Terry, one of the things that you do is you talk a lot about smart community, you talk about security, you talk about IT, you talk about smart ways to engage digitally, but you talk to a diverse audience. What is one tip that you can give us in terms of how to engage your audience with a subject, especially on cybersecurity and smart communities, that is very new to them? Terry?
It's very, very difficult. Cybersecurity is a very complex field. And what's happening is there's some great experts in this community, but the problem is they have a hard time articulating it in layman's terms to most people, right? So the moment you hear cybersecurity, it's too complex. I don't have the time, my IT guy will cover it. He takes care of it for me. Yep. So what I'm finding through my success in getting through to some of these folks is to make it what's called edutaining. It's got to be educational and entertaining at the same time. So you got to make sure you inject humor into what you're teaching them. And what I'm noticing is that, especially with small businesses or even home users, no one's going to want to hack me. I'm small fish. They want the big guys, but they don't realize that they actually are the number one target because they don't have the time, the budget, or the resources to even handle cybersecurity.
Absolutely. A wise person once said, good teachers are good performers and are very good artists. They know how to keep the crowd engaged. And I said this yesterday, right, is that when you're a good teacher, you don't just look at how am I doing, you look at how the audience is doing, and you know how to take the pulse.
Absolutely.
Which is a good opportunity for me to bring Delroy into the conversation, because just like it says behind you, one vision, one dream, and sort of that approach of knowing what you're going after. Have you found that when it comes to the conversations that you're having, are there any questions around resource deficits in the Caribbean, and how are we going to get things done if we don't have efficient, or if we have a technical and a talent deficit? Can you comment a little bit on that, Delroy?
I'll take it from the second one first. We don't have a talent deficit.
Excellent.
When we speak to the Caribbean, we speak to those who are sitting right here, but also those in the diaspora, including Canada, who contribute, from far and abroad. From a resource perspective, we're challenged in that we're not connected geographically by land, right? We're all separated by a body of water at the very least. And so the network, the connectivity, that's key there. And that's the gap we have to bridge in terms of how it is that we can understand and then leverage our resources.
Yep.
If we look at how it is the Caribbean even moves and things together, and Terry, you touched on cybersecurity. We're seeing where the data protection laws are moving across the region as a cultural shift in terms of where we want to go as one. But the resources to support that are challenged in terms of getting alignment on the public-private partnerships to get those laws moving in the right direction at the same time. If you have east to west going at different times or north to south going at different times, it means the interconnect between our markets becomes a challenge.
Yeah.
So it's really, the resources is really around conversations like these, how it is that we get our cultural norms into the same room so we can have that one culture methodology. At Caribbean Wireless, it's a driver for us, that one culture, despite the many countries that we operate in. We have to push that one culture. So as a government-private partnership, we need that as well. We can leverage the resources left and right, as you said. Leslie, you spoke to Guyana and their oil find. We're all happy for them. But before Guyana, there was Trinidad. Before Trinidad, there was Barbados with the White Sands. We all have something to contribute. It's what does that community look like, and how do we get those communities connected via culture?
Absolutely, and that unification under one umbrella, I think, is very, very important for a number of reasons. I say this all the time, never underestimate, from a quantitative perspective, the quality of the impact that you could have. To the world, you're one person, but to one person, you are their world. And when you're trying to push for a particular message, you are the world of resources. You are the world of opportunity to many folks. I want to take this aspect. You mentioned a lot about the diaspora and the connections between the Caribbean and Canada and the talent exchange that is happening. I know this, that, being an academic myself, we have students who go to the Caribbean. We have students from the Caribbean that come here who have very specific impact in the Canadian context. And Mark, this is a good opportunity to bring you into this. Not only do you teach at a college, you have been at the helm of various municipalities. Can you talk to me a little bit about why it's been important to have that exchange between Canada and the Caribbean from a talent and a tech perspective?
Sure. So, can you guys hear me now? All right.
Yes, we can.
Great. So, it's important because we have there's a talent gap in very specific things that are not tried here before. Sometimes places that have a different problem set to solve have solved problems that we create when we're doing something new for the first time.
Yep.
One of those problems that I would say is related to intelligent and smart communities is the dichotomy between the vendor and public partnership that was discussed earlier, because the company that can make the technology so that this can happen, they have a goal. They're trying to figure out, how do I monetize this thing? Do I monetize the citizen data? Do I monetize the exchange? Who pays for it? How does that all work? And then the communities want their communities to be better. And sometimes they may accidentally sacrifice too much in the early days, like we saw some of the controversy around what was happening with the Cybok Labs. But I liked a lot of the things that they were doing. I went to some of their demonstration centers and thought, wow, this is really cool. But then it comes back to figuring out how we're going to monetize that.
Absolutely.
So I think that there's maybe this may have already been figured out, and we need to explore the talent pools in other places as well.
Absolutely, and I do want to later on in the conversation, because I know there'll be questions about this, I want to look at how test beds could be created between both the Caribbean context and in Canada, because there are certain conditions, especially around security, that could be very well realized in the Caribbean context. So we'll come to that towards the end. Leslie, I want to come to you, and this is about the topic of, we all understand that the ideal around smart communities, the idea of how can we leverage technology and information communications technology better is at the forefront of every community in the world. Everybody wants to see how they can translate technology better into their community context. But there is a question of priorities, and I've said this repeatedly. Priorities is not about knowing what's important, it's about knowing what you can get done effectively. I want to ask you, Leslie, and then we'll go back to Michael and then Delroy, is how do you prioritize in the Caribbean around which smart communities initiatives are of importance to you? Leslie?
Yeah, great question. So ultimately, and this is irregardless of the technology or the product or the solution. First, we focus on value, right? So, what's going to give us the most bang for our buck? And that's the, first and most important thing. What has the highest impact? And then secondly, we look at, is this strategic alignment for this particular thing? And if there is, what are the resources we need? Do we have a neighbor with that experience, that expertise that we can probably borrow from? Is there a lesson from the Caribbean or just from the globe that we can take and reuse? And I think that's, in the Caribbean context, really important for us.
Absolutely. And I do want to come back again to this sharing aspect, because issues around governance and information sharing within the Caribbean, I think, has a lot of lessons to be learned for us here in Canada. So we will come back to that. Thank you all for bringing up these very important nuggets of information. I do want to just take a pause with that idea and move to another one, which what you brought up, Leslie, is you need to also know about value. And Michael, I'll bring it to you. How do you articulate value around smart communities and build trust around the initiatives that you're trying to propose in the Caribbean?
Sure. Again, value is relative, right? And I think sometimes we approach a problem from the wrong angle. We're on this drive to connect everything. Let's connect everything, right? Without necessarily thinking about the impact.
Yep.
What are we trying to resolve? In the Caribbean context, there are quite a few things that we can use smarter technologies and the Internet of Things to resolve. I'll give an example, right? We're in the Caribbean, which means we're all surrounded by water.
Yeah.
So water everywhere, not a drop to drink.
Right.
So water scarcity is a real thing for most Caribbean nations. We depend on rainfall to get water. But most people in the Caribbean will tell you, our water and sewage infrastructure leaves a bit to be desired, right? We have a lot of leakages, which means that any water reserves we have are actually being depleted just by pure wastage. I think a great application for smarter communities as a concept would be smarter management of water reserves in terms of how it's distributed, how it's captured, identification of leaks, and all that. It needs to be practical. It really needs to make people's lives better. So when it comes to articulating value, I think it needs to be in the context of our respective challenges and opportunities.
Thank you. And in keeping with that metaphor of water everywhere, one of the biggest problems we have here in Canada is we keep chasing the waves. We don't let things come to us. We keep chasing the shiniest and brightest, and then we don't quite know where we're headed. So I do appreciate that context, and I do appreciate the specific example that you've given. I'm going to come to Delroy and then go to Terry with a very specific question. But Delroy, speaking of this articulation of value and realizing where, for lack of a better word, priorities lie and the pain points are, how challenging is it? I get it that cable and wireless, as a major provider of telecom infrastructure, all roads to some degree lead to you at the end of the day for backbone architecture, so on and so forth. But how challenging is it sometimes to engage the right government parties to not just come to the table, but to actually stay for the actual party and be there for the work? Delroy?
It's a double-edged challenge, not a double-edged sword, a double-edged challenge. So it's not hard, it's not difficult to engage in any form of markets with government to get them to come to the table. What does pose a challenge is how it is that we stay at the table, right?
Yep.
Specific projects or initiatives will quite often flow all the way through. But building smart communities is more than that specific project. It's about the ongoing dialogue, the ongoing understanding as information flows between private and public. I'll give you a real-world example. I was almost late for this presentation because we had an opening ceremony for a cultural district in Kingston, downtown Kingston here in Jamaica.
Right.
And this cultural district is about revitalizing downtown, for which we are 100% behind. But it required a lot of public-private participation. Government was there, right? The cultural department was there. They participated in providing a lot of infrastructure and the support. But although we worked together, we weren't always at the same table at the same time. And so who knows what else we could have done or what else is yet to be done in this regard. And that's across the wider markets. We have to keep our cultural districts and groups engaged with government and private sector, because we also have a commercial obligation to meet, but we also have a community obligation. And so the two must interconnect consistently across the board. It can't be up and down. It has to be consistent, and that's the challenge. As governments change, as priorities change, as focuses change, right? You have an election, you have a pandemic, right? When these things happen, which groups, which communities, which forums, which boards maintain that focus on the smart communities, and that's where you need that consistency. In my view, the only way to achieve that is to declare straight from the get-go, here are the persons, here are the groups across the markets, across the countries, who are going to lead this drive, right? The thought leaders like what we have here in this forum, here are the persons who are going to lead this, here are the persons who are going to drive this through, rain or sleet or snow, and that's how we're going to get it done.
And I guess this is an important element that you have to think about responsibility. You have to think about ownership around these initiatives. And this ultimately brings us to the fact that when you're talking about consistency, you're talking about protection as well. Again, so these are new environments for a lot of these communities, which is a good opportunity for me to bring Terry into this. And then I'll come with a similar question to Mark. And Terry, you study the threat landscape from multiple perspectives, from the inside and from the outside, from within the organizations and from outside of the organizations. When you think of the Caribbean and you think of the way the enterprise of the Caribbean is set up across water masses, the types of population, the types of traffic going in and out, as these smart communities initiatives are getting realized in the Caribbean, what are some of the security concerns that they need to be paying attention to? Terry?
I think it's as was mentioned, where Internet of Things, IoT, is being just plugged up everywhere. And a perfect story of what happened to a casino in Las Vegas, where they have very, very, very tight security, but they had this glorified fish tank where they brought in this IoT device that would clean the water.
Right.
And that device was actually vulnerable. So the hackers were able to break into the fish tank into the corporate network. So that's the other problem. When you connect these IoT devices, you don't know how secure they really are because you don't have access to the code.
Correct.
And they can actually endanger your network.
And this aspect of realizing that the perimeter, I mean, we've not only just spoken about the security perimeter being dead, we've spoken about identity as the new perimeter. As you open up new initiatives, the perimeter changes consistently. Mark, you've been a part of initiatives where you've started off something new in a community from a smart communities perspective, and you've had challenges in ensuring that from a security perspective, not only do you have buy-in from the vendors and you have a good process in place, but you have the community engaged in best practices. What are some of the challenges in ensuring that the communities that are receiving some of these smart communities benefits take on safe practices with their engagement?
So oddly enough, it's not different than any other technical project.
Yep.
It's quality versus timeline. So you have a published thing that you're doing, an initiative, like you said, you have engaged stakeholders, sometimes politicians and sometimes the community, and you want these people to be engaged. You want them to understand and feel they have a stake in this. But then you have a vendor maybe that's not opening up their platform for you, so you can't really look at it. You're going to put it in your fish tank to clean it, and you don't know how the thing works. Yep. And then there's rush to go live. So we need to get this thing going. There's an event around it or whatever it is that we're doing. And we often compromise security, as I'm sure everybody did because of COVID. I just need it to work. Don't lock it down too much. Lots of people did that. It becomes similar with this brand new thing that we're hooking up that is fundamentally new and different, and that's fantastic. But we've hooked it up to a network. Maybe we hooked it up to corporate LAN, like the casino example. And maybe it was rushed and not even done by the people who normally take care, who are normally the custodians of that network. So I think the biggest threat is the waves you talked about. Yeah. We do these waves, we want to complete them, and there's a certain amount of urgency behind it, and that can introduce an acceptance risk tolerance that is higher than normal.
Absolutely. And in keeping with this idea of what we choose to pursue and what we don't, comes the ultimate question of how we fund these and how we plan financially for these projects. And Delroy, we'll start with you and then go to Leslie and then over to Michael. Delroy, I've often said that money is the price that you pay, but value is what you get. From a CapEx, OpEx perspective, are there any challenges peculiar to the Caribbean when it comes to, yes, this is what we need up front, but this is what we're going to need operationally? Is the disaster recovery framework a little different? Is the BCP guidelines a little different? Talk to us a little bit about what it means to inject cash into a project, but then to have a project be functional over a period of time. Delroy?
Sure. The biggest challenge in the Caribbean is really around population, right? As any other commercial organization, you need a return on investment, and you have to be able to invest in CapEx or OpEx in the right areas, put CapEx and OpEx in the right areas, invest for that return. When you have such a distributed group of islands, and even within the Bahamas, for example, even smaller family islands, it becomes a challenge in terms of how you put infrastructure in to get that return. Nonetheless, it's become practice, right? We've been here all our lives, clearly.
Yep.
And it is now a part of practice. So now I think we've tweaked it and tuned it to the point where we know what we need to do, we know we need to go forward. On a BCP disaster recovery perspective, I'm going to beat my chest and say no one knows it better than the Caribbeans, right? We know how to properly protect our islands, protect ourselves. We know how to build it. We know how to build it for resilience. What we still have to do, however, is to get the different dots connected from island to island, from country to country across the group. So we're not duplicating, we're all on the same wave together, right? Not necessarily the latest wave, as you put it earlier, and invest in that way. And if you look historically, we don't tend to be on the first wave or even the second. We tend to be a little bit behind, work on what's tried and proven. We look at countries like Estonia, for example. Even within our own ponds, we look sometimes at what Barbados is doing in Jamaica, or we look at what's happening in Trinidad. Guyana is going to learn from Trinidad. Trinidad is going to learn from Jamaica in different ways. So that's the beauty of it. We get to test it in our own melting pot in a faster way and get it to market and maximize that CapEx, OpEx investment in that regard.
Absolutely. Michael, if we can go to you and then we'll go to Leslie. Michael, when it comes to CapEx and OpEx and the opportunities in the Caribbean, how do you present the opportunities internally, but how do you also present it to international stakeholders? Are you seeing an interest in international stakeholders willing to invest in projects in the Caribbean, or is it mostly locally and sourced from your own funds? Michael?
Yeah. So I think where value is concerned around OpEx and CapEx, I think it depends on who's holding the purse, right? Obviously, those conversations with governments would be different to those conversations with the private sector. There's definitely interest from around the world. There are lots of suitors for our attention and our resources and our money. That's a fact, right? It's an open economy, open market. So those sorts of things will prevail. Delroy brought up the Estonia example. Estonia is actually a very good parallel to the Trinidadian context. Yeah. They are 1.3 million people. We are 1.3 million people as a population. They are a network of islands. The Caribbean is a network of islands. And what they were able to do with limited resources and arguably the same pool of human resources was amazing, right? It took them 20 years to do it. And the value that they are trying to articulate to Caribbean nations is we can help you jumpstart or leapfrog that 20-year learning curve, and you can be up and running in a couple of months. And I think that's important, and that is the best way to unlock some of those investments and unlock borrowing capacity, for example, from the World Bank and those sorts of things, when there is a well-defined vision that shows return on those investments. When it's being funneled through governments, of course, there is a political tint or hue to those things, and that too needs to be considered. Again, it'll vary from country to country, and that's probably a theme we're going to hear throughout, right? Trinidad is ready to do it. We just need to find the right partner.
Absolutely. And in speaking of partnerships, I'll come to Leslie. And Leslie, this aspect of what I mentioned to Mark a little earlier on is the creation of partnerships really ultimately comes down to value and what you can bring to the table. Are you seeing that you have now more opportunities in the Caribbean to create test beds for new technologies? Are you seeing perhaps an interest in the startup environment and smart communities and IoT? What are you seeing in terms of testing, trial and error kind of environments?
So there's a lot of movement around startups and new technology initiatives. I mean, one of the pioneers for blockchain technology and decentralized central banking is based out of Barbados. Yep. But if you travel island to island, and then there's some territories in the Caribbean that are not islands, they're parts of South America, you realize there are vast quantities of extremely bright people, but are generally under-resourced. So I find it my mission to connect a lot of these people because we're all headed in the same direction, and we're all learning the same lessons, but it's just taking us so much longer because we're doing it on our own. But we're also, we can export to the rest of the world, guys. There's ultimately, in my opinion, something that is unique to the Caribbean, and that's creativity. Absolutely. And everybody has some level of creativity. But in the region, we've always had to do more with less. Yep. And, there's always a joke about you put a Jamaican, a Trini, and a Canadian in a room and what the outcome is, right? So That's kind of my take on it, Ali. Thank you.
No, absolutely. And to our audience, I highly recommend that, you take some of the time to read books like by V.S. Naipaul, or you read books about the diaspora and the Caribbean, because creativity is not just a matter of a way of life, it's a matter of survival. You look at dishes like doubles as an example, and you look at how they formed as a result of working in the fields and as a result of trying to maintain a staple diet and the creativity that came with that. So while you enjoy that next meal here in Ajax of doubles, just think about the creativity that went into it and think about the source of what doubles was before. Just a little bit of a thought. But Leslie, you brought up this example of blockchain. And Terry, I want to bring you and then Mark back into the conversation. Terry, this is perhaps my perspective, and I would love to be educated further on this. Blockchain, we refer to it as mathematical proof that something happened. I don't necessarily subscribe to that, but sure. But Terry, what's your opinion about the role of blockchain in cybersecurity? Do you see them as parallel? Do you see them as different? I'd like to see your lens on this.
I apologize. I am not the right person to answer that question. I actually took a small 1-hour course on how that whole thing works, and I still can't wrap my head around it. So I can't even comment on that question.
But at the root of
sorry.
blockchain, that's fine, but at the root of blockchain is this aspect of automation of security, and is the aspect of artificial intelligence. Given the position that you're hearing the Caribbean is in right now, do you think artificial intelligence and security and automation and security could find a very neat test bed in the Caribbean?
I think so, but you know what? If you think about it from the dark side as well, right? Imagine being able to say, "Hey Google, go and hack that company." That could be a real threat in the coming years. So you never know how the AI is going to be used against you. It's good for good stuff, but you never know.
Absolutely. And Mark, I want to build on what Terry said on this aspect of threat intelligence and the automation piece as well. As you're seeing that our friends in the Caribbean are engaging in more automation-based projects, engaging in more data-driven smart cities kind of projects, what are some pieces of advice you'd like to share in terms of your own learnings, both in Sarnia, in Stratford, and now in Waterloo, on how to deal with data and how to know how to parse through that data? Mark?
I think the most important thing is to have a universal approach. So we have unstructured data, which is files, Excel, my database didn't work. We have structured data inside of our database, and we tend to treat it differently, whether it's cloud or whether it's on-premise or whether it starts as paper or doesn't, or who it's managed by. And I want to go back to a second what you mentioned about blockchain and what good it could do. So I'm fairly confident that I could say it is a mutable system, meaning that once you put something in there, it's hard to change it. Yep. And that is backed up by the current best cryptography we currently have that may or may not withstand quantum, for example. Yeah. But for now, it works. And once we have that problem where it doesn't, then everything's broken. The other thing that you mentioned was automation. So there was an attempt to create what were called smart contracts under a platform called Ethereum. And the idea was that you could automate a lot of paralegal work, you could automate a bunch of other interesting things. I think one day we might see it used for something like citizen identity. We don't have a good, strong citizen identity here, like, for example, Estonia has. And I would like to see that. Then we have what was mentioned about, hey, Google will hack that company. That's sort of already real. Ransomware as a service is a thing that exists, and you can go and purchase it and have no idea how it works. So it's not just what we would call script kiddies anymore. It's now a complete layman can purchase the service anonymously to have a hack done for them and then take a split of the profits.
Absolutely.
And I think municipalities need to consider that that threat is being automated and that their responses are not being automated and that their data isn't their data. They're custodians. It used to be that it was a file folder on a shelf, so you had a clerk in between the citizen and the data. But now, I think we should move to a model where the citizen is the primary owner of the data, and in lieu of them not being able to understand how to manage it, or for other practical reasons, the municipality, the city, the government are the caretaker of it, but they don't own it.
Absolutely, and this relationship with government is one that I want to talk to about a little bit more than this. In our previous session, we were talking about Edward Snowden and the book that he had written, and I want to come back to our friends in the Caribbean, starting with Leslie. We'll go to Michael and then Delroy. Leslie, this aspect of privacy, as you're moving more and more into more Wi-Fi enabled environments, more smart cities, smart devices enabled environments, ultimately brings up the value and the question of privacy. And privacy and security being two very different things. Furthermore, the involvement and the input from your community and the end users. Edward Snowden puts it brilliantly, which is, I'd rather not have a nation than not have a voice. I'd rather be stateless than be voiceless. How are you ensuring that you're getting input from the end users and getting their buy-in into the initiatives that you're doing? Leslie?
Yeah, so the Caribbean is quite still superstitious about these things. I remember in Jamaica, there's a single ID program called NIDS that we were launching, and the general consensus it was the mark of the beast.
Right.
So for me, getting moving things along in terms of the citizenry is all about education. It's about helping to demystify a lot of these technologies to make it a lot less complicated. I mean, when we say blockchain and cyber attacks and all of these things, the typical person gets scared. So we need to understand, one, what does it do for me? What does it mean for me as a citizen of the country?
Yeah.
And be able to express that on a level that is relatable to everyone else.
Yep. And I really like this example about how it's perceived in terms of some apocalyptic fantasies, in terms of cultural fantasies, as well as all of this speaks to a good example that I can give you is in Pakistan as well, right? Or in India for that matter, when new initiatives were brought up on tagging products or tagging individuals as well, it was seen as, like you said, the mark of the devil. And understanding the buy-in from the community ultimately influences the quality of the process. I want to go to Michael a little and just build on what Leslie spoke about. And not only is it an aspect of buy-in from the community and consultations with the community, it's also the aspect of making sure that the community will adopt whatever it is that you have in place. It's one thing to begin the process, but to continue that. Do you look for community champions? Do you look for running programs? Do you engage in hackathons of some sort? What are you doing to ensure that the community remains engaged with the initiatives that you're running?
Yeah. It comes down to the same way we would approach it in sales, right? If we were selling to a company, if we're selling a concept to a community or to a nation, it has to be education and proof of concept. People aren't going to buy in. They're not going to have the confidence in the solution you're selling them unless you can demonstrate that, one, there's value to be gained, and two, there's no implication. If the cure is worse than the ailment, then nobody's going to want it, right? So it comes down to how well the champions for that particular solution or concept or system articulate the value in a way that instills confidence. At a nationwide level, we see it in pockets. It typically comes from, again, those private-public partnerships.
Yep.
The Caribbean people are not the only folks who have, superstitions or nefarious thoughts about what government is doing with your data. That's not a unique thing. That's global. So it really comes down to those proofs of concept, and you have to do it in pilots, in bite-sized pieces, and step people into what a more pervasive outcome could be.
Absolutely. And Delroy, if it's okay with you, I want to go to Terry and then come back to you and then Mark. And Terry, you've been very involved in engaging community members around cybersecurity and giving them new, unique environments with which to experience security experiences, to experience IoT, so on and so forth. In your opinion, two questions rather. What's the importance of having these kind of hackathons and these festivals where people can experience and showcase their skills? And B, do you see any opportunities to collaborate between the work that you're doing, siberX, and the Caribbean? Terry?
Oh, absolutely, yeah. So the thing about the hackathons is that it opens the eyes to newcomers to the field. A lot of times when I present internet safety or cybersecurity in schools, and I ask the question, what do you want to be when you grow up? Obviously, the number one answer is I want to be a YouTuber, right? They don't want to come into cybersecurity. But this is a field that is very in demand right now, right? We're almost 2.5 million personnel short in our industry worldwide. And the money is great, but you're in a field where you're never going to win, right? And it's a very, it can be depressing too, because everything you're trying to put in place is not necessarily working because there's so many ways to circumvent this stuff.
Right.
So my focus right now is how do I bring more value around cybersecurity and how to protect yourself in a more educational way and more sexy way, we'll say.
Yep.
So whether that be through virtual reality, or I'm in the process of building a mobile app for myself.
Right.
So you'll be able to subscribe to me, and then I'll be able to send you a real-time alert that, hey, watch out for this fraud.
Right.
Or here's a video or something like that that'll get you educated.
Right.
That's some of the challenges that I'm facing right now.
Yep.
But yeah, definitely virtual reality, gaming, anything I can do to make it fun for the kids to jump into this industry, I think is going to be key.
Absolutely. And you know, the other aspect is even the studio that we're in right now, right? When the new normal has just been behind screens, suddenly you're now able to take a studio and throw in the right technologies and make it into an experience that that really makes the in-person or the hybrid realities come to life. So I do appreciate the aspect of, you know, and what you mentioned earlier on edutainment. Dilra, I'll bring it to you now in terms of the corporate responsibility now that the Cable and Wireless and you yourself are taking on to ensure that opportunities are created for students and for young learners. I know Cable and Wireless ensures that it supports various initiatives, but are there any particular initiatives that you're doing to support engagements for youngsters around smart cities, IoT, and security? Dilra?
Whoa, that's a big question. We are doing so many things.
Yeah.
We spoke about hackathons. We speak about how it is that we educate our schools, our activity within the schools across the different learning levels, right? How it is that our corporate social responsibility team, our CSRs, go out each and every day pretty much working at how it is that our communities engage with technology. That's key. The simple statistics are, even though across the countries we have over 100% smartphone penetration, mobile phone penetration, smartphone penetration lags significantly, right? You're looking at in the 40% on average. And so that divide means you have a group of citizens, pretty much the younger ones, who are doing things like creating honeycombs that can either hack or defend, right? You're talking about 1,000 different virtual machines, thousands of different virtual machines sitting that were created by students. But their parents and their grandparents are still struggling to understand how to engage with their mobile devices beyond WhatsApp, etc.
Right.
So we have to come in between to help them to understand, to make technology kind of disappear in the background.
Yeah.
You know, simplify the use portion of it as best as possible, and then completely, you know, hide the security part in terms of making it ubiquitous. They don't think about insurance, they don't think about healthcare. These are the things that we have to make it, you know, similar in that regards. And that means working with the students as they go through the tertiary level institutions, but also working with those with disabilities, those who are elderly, working across the diaspora, across the different age groups to educate. And we actually have the region's largest internship program as the largest telco as well. Large internship program, most successful as well. We look at how it is that our own staff, our own people go through their own learnings, their own development. We have a very, very big focus on our people, right? Our community, our culture. And so it is a part of how we live, how we breathe. And that's how we have to do it. Across our orgs and across all the others. It has to be bred. It has to be bred from us.
Absolutely. And you've heard me say this repeatedly if you join the other sessions, that it's not about just investing in strategy and tools, it's about investing in people and creating that safety zone for them to fail and get creative and learn from that. So I really appreciate the perspective that you provided, because it brings me to the context here. And Mark and myself have spoken a lot about this, is here in Durham region where we're situated, and the town of Ajax is part of a region here called Durham region. We have a company here that which is based in recruitment. They say, you know, one of the biggest problems we have is we hire for skill and then we fire for fit. You know, people join in, they've got the skill set, but then they're not the right fit. And a lot of this has to do with the lack of recognition. Mark, if I could ask you, you've been involved in a lot of smart community initiatives, and one of the things that you've always done is try to make sure in whatever initiatives that you're doing, besides creating opportunities for hackathons and exchanges, so on and so forth, you've also emphasized on awards and recognition and making sure that people get some sort of a platform to be celebrated. Mm-hmm. Why is that important, and what recommendations would you like to provide our friends from the Caribbean in terms of some lessons learned from your own practices?
So it's important because the community gets to celebrate and they get to feel that there's an accomplishment. And most of the time there really is something significant that's happened. It creates an appetite so that it's not a thing that just happens and, okay, we did it and now we're done and we forget about it. it's a reminder of what you can do together, and it kind of unifies a bunch of groups. So you've got all these silos. You've got, you've got utilities, you've got cities, you've got companies that are local, you've got colleges, educations, you've got hospitals, and they all operate in their own little silo thing, and they're all trying to do their neat extra thing. But when you get them all together, you find out there's enough resources, talent, and interesting thinking. A good example was one of the cities I was working with. Their project that was intelligent and smart wasn't even technology.
Fair.
It was called Dark Skies.
Yeah.
Canada has some of the most beautiful horizons and places to see that I've seen so far in my life. And we covered up with light pollution. So what they did was they partnered together and they just got directional lighting for all of the cottages and homes that were along the water. And you can go in the middle of a town and look up and see the stars like you were in the middle of nowhere.
Fantastic. And I think this goes back to even what was said earlier on, right? Is that this whole, I mean, you've heard me say it repeatedly, is that we don't just equate smart cities to the glitz and glamour of new technology. We really equate it to how people are just doing things differently and more effectively, right? You can be busy with technology, but you need to be effective with it. And I really appreciate the Caribbean perspective that we've got is about how do you measure effectivity? How do you measure the return on the investment that you're putting in on smart communities? We have about 9 minutes left, and I want to touch on two topics. Got a couple of questions, one for Terry, and then the rest for our friends from the Caribbean before we summarize with some conclusions. Terry, I'll begin with you, and that is about creating a culture of innovation, a culture of learning. One of the notes questions that says here is that when you talk about edutainment, you also talk about creating characters, creating something that you want to be. What goes through your mind when you create these special characters that you can become if you achieve certain education levels? What are you trying to do? What are you trying to bring out of the learners so that they feel empowered by the various characters and stages that they reach of their learning? Terry?
Sure. So I actually brought up some points earlier where, they get hired because they're very technical, but they get fired because they don't fit in. I can't stress enough that it takes more than just skill to make a name in this industry, right? So if you're highly skilled, you better learn how to be great in front of a camera and be able to articulate that in non-technobabble terms to other people, or else their eyes are just going to glaze over. So they need to think of role models. I'll give you an example. So my role model is Tony Robbins.
Yep.
My goal is to be the Tony Robbins of cybersecurity, where I can articulate my skill and knowledge into layman's terms so that anybody can follow along and take action.
Yep.
And I try to mimic his style and how he talks and all this kind of stuff. So that's how I emphasize to the kids, if they want to grow in this industry quick enough, they need to look at someone who's already doing it and kind of model what they're doing, and make sure that they learn how to share their knowledge with the world.
Fantastic. And on this aspect of how sharing your knowledge and what you do with that knowledge, I think it's also important, the aspect of mentors and the aspect of having role models that you can't just connect with digitally, but you can meet with, that you can talk to, that you can share your vulnerabilities with. A great sort of staircase with which to go into the next question that has come in. And Delroy, we'll start with you. We'll go to Leslie and then close with Michael and have closing comments from Mark. And this is this aspect of diversity. I said this in the Women in Cybersecurity panel that it is a very male-dominated industry, but not just male-dominated in terms of physicality, male-dominated in terms of how we think. And Karen Namani who was one of my panelists, brought up something really important that I think resonated well with my students, which was this aspect of look at even how we talk about security, how we talk about smart cities. The word pen test alone, penetration testing, what does it mean? What kind of messages does that give somebody from a non-male context about the space? Delroy, I want to start off with you in terms of how are you ensuring diversity in this space? I mean, we always say that a woman without a man is like a fish without a bicycle. What are you doing to ensure that women are empowered and that diversity is happening in the tech sector and in the smart community sectors of the Caribbean? Delroy?
Sure. It absolutely requires focus. At Caribbean Wireless, we ensure balance. And in fact, we have just over 50% of our employees being women as a large tech giant. So that we're very, very happy about that, very, very impressed with that. But as we go through the education system, as we look at our students, as we look at educational platforms, how it is that we engage, we're already seeing more women in classroom anyway, right? What we have to do is ensure that as we're teaching and as we're engaging, we're not locking them out of the conversation. Right? We're encouraging where it is that we see interest, wherever that interest may be, by the way.
Yep.
right? That's what we need to do. We need to support the objectives, the goals, the visions of all students, and that's how we look at it. But diversity is absolutely number one importance. From a cybersecurity standpoint, I don't think per se there's an active drive to say, yeah, we have to have X amount or Y amount. And that's where the focus is lacking. I think we actually have to take a close look at our actions, how it is that we engage, and drive that type of focus. It has to be intentional for change to happen.
Fantastic. And on this aspect of diversity, only because we have a couple of more minutes left, Leslie, we'll go to you and then Michael and close with Mark. Is Leslie, diversity also means, developing trust. As you're working with within the Caribbean Council, within different islands in the Caribbean, how are you working to develop trust in terms of sharing best practices, sharing data, and diversifying your own resource pool? Leslie?
Yeah, that's a great question. So in terms of building trust as it aligns with diversity, in our own practice, we are a very diverse group, and that's completely by default. The Caribbean, Trinidad especially, is a real melting pot of lots of cultures. So we don't even have to try to be diverse. We're born diverse. But in terms of building trust across the community, that diversity is reflected in our teams. And we do see, lots of different opinions. And it's sometimes not only about building trust, but it's also about appreciating those other perspectives and accepting those perspectives for what they are. And I think that earns trust in itself. Yeah. So we in Caribbean, I think there's a serious edge for us. And just coming back, because I know this is probably my last statement, and the warmth of the Caribbean is what you really mentioned. And I think the warmth of the Caribbean is reflected in its people. Yep. And this whole digital transformation that we're all on is all really, guys, it's all about people because the technology already exists. Yep. Mike mentioned the point in terms of political will, and I do a lot of conferences in terms of, getting involved with ministers, permanent secretaries, those sort of things. And what that also boils down to, and what I've learned from that, is that ministers and permanent secretaries, they're people as well. And this really, really boils down to individual will and individual responsibility for you all to get there.
Yep. Fantastic. And I think what drives a lot of us is to show value. And Mike, I'll bring this question to you is, what I've learned from you is that ROI, again, not just a matter of return on investment, but it's also about return on imagination. How do you make sure that the folks around you are staying up to date with what you're doing? And how do you always get them to see the bigger picture of some of these initiatives? Because when they begin, especially smart community initiatives, it's a bit of a black box. You don't quite know where it's headed to, but you trust the process. How do you make sure that they're well informed and they stay current with what you're working on?
Encourage them to go to every siberXchange webinar that there is to view. That's how I start.
Well played.
But I cannot do want to circle back to just the diversity question a little bit because I think my answer might be a little bit more value adding than the answer to your last question. We're kind of leaving it up to corporate policy to dictate or guide diversity in the workplace, right? And I think that's a couple steps too late. Okay, diversity and breakdown of stereotypes starts at home. Yeah. Okay, let's be frank, right? It starts at home. I'm guilty of it myself. I have 3 children, 2 boys, 1 girl. Very often I find myself having to fight the urge to tell my daughter, stop playing with G.I. Joes and pick up a Barbie, right? So that diversity of thought and that acceptance that regardless of your background, there's value to be had in having you around and having you being a team member really starts at home. And we need to acknowledge that, yes, corporate policy will grease those wheels, but it starts at home, as with many character building principles.
Absolutely. And with that, I'll turn it over to Mark. And Mark, I know you were a last-minute addition to this, but I asked you to join, rather Maddie asked you to join, very specifically because the end goal for this is the first of many. And we're looking at seeing how we can create partnerships between our work here in Canada and what options we have with our partners in the Caribbean from a perspective of the work that you do in hydro. Do you see any potential partnerships, or what's piquing your interest in terms of what our next conversations could look like? Mark, the closing floor to you.
Our networks are as resilient physically because the infrastructure requirements just aren't there. So hearing about some of the interesting and creative ways, ingenuitive ways that this has been done, that would be starting these conversations is what's important. Throughout the many intelligent community forums and conferences I've been to, those were the only times where I thought that I saw truly diversity of thought, which is why we care about diversity. It's about the exchange of ideas that come from different places, from different exposure and environments. And it's like I'm chatting with you in person here. It's fantastic.
Absolutely.
So being able to do that, doing more of it, is worth the investment of its only time.
Diversity and reliability, absolutely. So I have a couple of seconds to make closing comments before I thank our panelists. What I will say is I was debating whether this statement would hold true today, but I think it does. And that is this aspect that culture eats strategy for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. You can have all of the best strategies, but the culture with which you promote people to follow that strategy, the enablement, is ultimately what makes that strategy work. I think it's important for our audience to realize that the Caribbean context is one that has been isolated quite a bit, one that has been impacted a great deal by a distortion of their use of resources, and one that has seen a lot of misuse. And amidst all of that, to see such success stories shows us the power of not just diversity, but resilience. I'll go back to how I ended my keynote this morning, when I said that you want to be like that flower that gives its fragrance to the hand that crushes it. That flower of the Caribbean has been giving its fragrance to the world for a very long time, and I'm very honored and humbled that I'm a part of a group that's looking to create partnerships in cybersecurity and smart communities between Canada and the Caribbean, and I thank Maddie for his vision in making this happen. Before I thank the Friends of the Caribbean, Mark, thank you for being a last-minute addition. Really appreciate your perspective at all times. My friend Terry, I know that you normally talk about ethical hacking, so on and so forth, but you are a very engaging speaker, and I requested you to join because I really feel that from a gamification and an edutainment perspective, there could be some good opportunities for us, and I look forward to collaborating. And to my friends in the Caribbean, I look forward to perhaps one day meeting in person, talking about all things cricket and cool runnings. Take care and stay safe. If you can
Thanks
just
for
stay in
having
the
us.
green room, we'll have
Thank
some
you.
closing comments. Cheers. Bye for now.